All right, welcome to the presentation on the theory of legal identity fusion by Joel Wickwire, presenting from Odessa, Ukraine. Outline of the presentation, it's going to be a case study, Moldova-Transnistria negotiations. I'll briefly cover research methodology, psychological theory, applying the theory to negotiations, and then I'll conclude. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states that everyone shall have the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. When we think about relationships with the law, many different people might have different interaction. Some people might be before the law, some perhaps against the law, with the law, above the law, or entangled in the law. Here we're looking at before the law and with the law. And these themes kind of resonate with me. I am American. The Gettysburg Address is one example where Abraham Lincoln said, "A government of the people, by the people, for the people." So this kind of the theme of being one with kind of the government or the legal community is not something alien to me. But we also see this in customary law or Sharia law, where people may even combine like religion and law as one. So that would even compound the relationship that one may have with the law. So the case study here, though, is the 5+2 Moldova-Transnistria negotiations. When we think about the 5+2, that's we're talking about 5 parties to the mediation, which is Moldova, Transnistria, Russia, Ukraine, and the OSCE, and then 2 observers, US and EU. This is a good case study because Moldova is a relatively new nation. It established its parliament in 1991 after the independence after the retreat, the collapse of the USSR. And they actually had a constitutional convention where they brought in international scholars to kind of inform that process. So it was a unique case study to watch from the beginning how things have evolved. And Transnistria has a special status underneath the Constitution. So there's a lot of complexity there. Research methodology. So in developing this theory, I did research at the OSCE Documentation Center in Prague. I interviewed members of the Moldovan government. I've interviewed OSCE staff in different party states, interviewed non-governmental organizations that have worked on the periphery of this issue. And I've spent about 3 years in Central and Eastern Europe doing similar research, like in the Dayton Agreement in the Balkans. I spent time in Moldova, spent time in Czech Republic, and currently I'm in Ukraine. So first with the theory of identity fusion is going to be the foundational theory that I look at, but also social identity theory and intergroup contact theory are 2 big ones that contribute to this paper. And then I kind of narrow in on legal identity fusion. The theory of identity fusion, as presented by Swan et al., defined it as a form of alignment with groups that entails a visceral feeling of oneness with a group. The union with that group is so strong among highly fused persons that the boundaries that ordinarily demarcate the personal and social self become highly permeable. So this theory is actually originally applied to like riots and like protests when groups of people all begin acting irregular together. But here I'm applying it to where there's already a conflict and we're trying to bring parties that would not normally act together in cadence, whether we can try to encourage that oneness between conflicting parties. It's kind of a unique, perhaps hopefully not too radical application. 2 applicable types of identity fusion of interest here are local fusion, where people develop relational ties to members of relatively small groups, like families and working groups. Then we have extended fusion, where people project relational ties onto relatively large collectives composed of many individuals with whom they may not have personal relationships. So this is a complex situation with international parties, working groups, but we also have lower local level groups. So the legal behavior at the national level is called local legal fusion. And at the international legal level, we're talking about like the negotiation process, is extended legal fusion. Social identity theory, as per Tajal, theory, social identity is part of an integral self-concept that which derives from his knowledge of his membership of a social group or groups, together with the value and emotional significance attached to that membership. So people derive value from different group memberships. But identity fusion contrasts, fusion identity contrasts with SIT in that instead of individual experiencing depersonalization, like being part of that group, they gain value, but they actually become part of the group, so much so that they don't have their individual identity. But identity fusion takes that one step further and includes agency in that. So not only are they depersonalized, but they then have a certain agency with the group that is more action oriented. That's what we're looking at. So one thing that social identity theory does offer that another item that we want to consider is the optimal situation. When we have conflicting groups, the best time for them to reach fruitful outcomes in negotiations is when they have equal status, and they're working towards a common goal, and they're working cooperatively, interdependent, so they're not there under coercion, and where groups are supported by laws, customs, institutions, when there's common authority that's supporting the process. Then we have intergroup contact theory by Allport. Context, when there's more contact between hostile groups, they tend to be less hostile towards each other, which promotes harmony and mutual understanding, which is important. Contact is most important when occurring under facilitated conditions, like the optimal situation. So when we're looking at local legal fusion and extended legal fusion, the Moldovan Constitution was, a great example of where they brought in external experts to help support the internal local legal fusion, because a constitution is a perfect example of building a new identity based on legal principles, right? When they declared independence, they're no longer, their old identities were now being replaced with a new independent Moldovan identity. But so the Constitution does include special status for Transnistria, who kind of wanted independence but didn't quite get it. So they were still struggling with their legal identity, and they tried to have a referendum. But this ran contrary to the Constitution and created a larger roadblock, which I'll touch on a little bit later, within the negotiations. And then the negotiations themselves, right? Not only are there working groups, but negotiations need to be based on procedural protocol that both parties agree to, or else they will not move forward smoothly, which has been the case in these negotiations. I mean, this is a famously protracted conflict. And then the various levels of working groups, we have everything from all parties at the high levels where we're talking about, international, mixing international and local, to very local level working groups where the local legal fusion would occur. So we're looking at comparison of external identities. We all have many different identities and groups that we belong to. Here, international law is the one that I think helps to facilitate the conversation best. But we also need to consider culture. We have Western culture, Russia, Romania, Ukraine, regional economic partnerships. We have other organizations like OSCE, NATO, EU, that Moldova engages with. And we also have religion. There's complex religious relationships. Ukraine's recently separated from the Russian Orthodox Church, right? So these are all play a role in the identity of the region. Examples of roadblocks and a few solutions. So travel has been a big problem for Transnistria. So the license plate law was lack of travel was a problem. The license plate law was a solution. They built new railways and built bridges that help with the ability of Transnistria to develop economically, legally and economically. But then we so there was time, and early on in negotiations, they had a problem, where would they meet? Transnistrians didn't want to meet too far into Moldova. Moldovans didn't want to meet too far into Transnistria. So they had to find a convenient meeting place. The OSCE provided an office in Bender, a city where they both sides saw as a neutral territory. So you need to solve solutions to these conflicts in identity. And then special status of development of the legal systems. The legal systems is a complicated issue because Transnistria has its own legal system, which that Moldova doesn't technically recognize, but they have to work within. So they being able to communicate between the legal systems is key. So examples from the ongoing talks. Here we see the special legal status for the left side. They create the desire to create a unified legal system, and and then here near the bottom you see basing upon the compliance with the supremacy of law. So, and just the need to give legal assistance to the Transnistrians. So they're trying to build the capacity in order for them to be able to communicate on a more equal legal level. Here's another one statement by it's the declaration of the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs, Moldovan Foreign Affairs. This is the referendum when Transnistria tried to have when they had the referendum. This was the Moldovans saw this as anti-constitutional. This delayed talks. This was a deal breaker for the Moldovans. Talks actually stopped for 5 years. It wasn't until 2011 that talks resumed, but they had to start all the way back over with the base protocol of the negotiations. Right? They had to agree on the most simple principles and procedures to guide the negotiations before they could even reach back up to address some of the bigger issues that working groups have worked on since. So even here, we see again, criminal cases, there's different elements. So criminal cases were an issue for both sides. There was political prisoners, but here they just emphasize that yes, there is a legal dimension even in this realm. But the criminal issue is something that Moldova tried to table. They wanted to decide it because they didn't see it as something that they could move forward on. So you have to pick and choose between what legal issues you want to address, promote, where you can agree on. So like any other collective group of issues, you need to be able to address certain ones at certain times in order to make progress. So today in Moldova, Ukraine has recently commented that Russia continues to slow the progress in these talks, and Russia has commented the U.S. is using Moldova as a like digging in the region. So external players still play a critical role in either moving things forward or stalling. But Moldova itself has had turbulent politics over the last few years. If the politics were a little more stable in Moldova, we might see a little better progress. So just in summary, the case study explored Moldova Transnistria negotiations. The unique constitutional structure makes this an interesting case study. With the special status for Transnistria, their attempt at referendum, the emphasis on protocol and the negotiations in this case study give us multiple layers of where rules, regulations, and laws provide avenues for opportunities, or can be big time deal breakers, like with the referendum. The psychological theory proposed here or applied was identity fusion, social identity theory, and intergroup contact theory, with me narrowing in on applying it to legal identity theory. In conclusion, legal identity fusion offers conflicting parties a shared identity based in legal mechanisms through which they are able to practice collective agency to achieve enforceable, agreed upon objectives. And there's some references. Thank you for your time.